Greetings of the day, viewers. I welcome you all to the very first episode of FIC Charcha, a one-stop destination for all your business, finance, and most of all, entertainment needs. This is a podcast series initiated by the Finance and Investment Cell of Aryabhat College, sponsored by Uniline Energy India and Delhi School of Communication. This is your host, Sufia Salim, and I hope all of you are safe and doing well. Well, this isn't one of those boring interviews that you watch on your TV. It is going to be refreshing, entertaining, and full of information. So, without any further ado, let me quickly introduce our speaker for the very first session of FIC Charcha, Mr. Michael Kugelman. Mr. Kugelman is currently serving as the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. In this episode, we have discussed about various issues between India and Pakistan and the trade barriers between both the neighboring countries. He has also talked about the nationwide lockdown and how to safeguard the interests of low-income families. Apart from this, let me tell you one interesting fact about Mr. Kugelman. He is not a journalist. It is a very big misconception about him. A lot more in this exclusive episode with Mr. Michael Kugelman and with all the enthusiasm. Now, I would like to introduce Manya Monga, who is the Associate Member of Finance and Investment Cell of Aryabhat College, to start with the very first episode of this series. So grab a snack and enjoy this episode. Thank you.
Well, greetings for the day, sir. It's nice to see you here.
Great to see you as well. Thanks for having me.
Yes. How has the pandemic been for you in general?
Well, I mean, the pandemic has been really tough in the United States. Last year was a really rough year. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel because the vaccine campaign is in full place right now in the United States. But, one thing that we've learned about this pandemic, not just here but anywhere, is right when you think things may be getting better, things can get bad again. So it's important that none of us be complacent.
Exactly. You were very right in saying that when we think that things are going to get better, they actually get worse. And this has been happening in India as of now. And we have been witnessing a significant rise in the COVID cases, the highest being 2 lakh cases per day. And so my first question is related to the pandemic itself. So the second wave of pandemic has hit India with all its force, and with cases rising every day, experts are suggesting a nationwide lockdown. What long-term policy can be introduced and implemented to safeguard the interests of low-income people of the country and to protect them from inequalities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is such a challenge for a country like India that has to bear with the reality of not just low-income families, but poverty on the whole. And so many people that can't afford to just work from home or ride out a lockdown. They have to be out there working. And I think that the only long-term solution in the particular context of the current pandemic is to do whatever is possible to ramp up the vaccination campaign. And I know that India has been trying to keep up, but it's so difficult. And especially with this incredibly dangerous new surge in cases in India over the last few weeks. But getting the vaccine campaign ramped up is key. And I think it would be ideal if the U.S. were to end its export controls, which has prevented raw materials for vaccine production from getting out of the United States to countries like India that really need them. So let's hope that there could be some cooperation that the U.S. can help to ensure that countries like India, with their very large populations, all these low-income families, will have access to vaccines to finally enable this pandemic to be weakened.
Exactly. So in India, we believe in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that is, the world is one. So if such collaborations are actually helping the world overcome this deadly pandemic, it's going to be amazing. Also, sir, I was watching the news with my dad and we saw another major headline that people had started again, actually. This is the second time it is happening in India. People had again started walking on foot to reach their villages because they are out of work in cities and the cost of living in cities is definitely higher. I believe that this migration in the middle of pandemic is not right. Well, what can be done by any country in general to provide relief to such migrant workers who are coming from one place and are moving to another in search of work? And after this pandemic, they have been left without any employment. So what should the government do for such people?
Well, I think the first step is for the government to actually help these people. I think one of the concerns, you're right, this has happened twice. The first time this happened last year, these people were essentially on their own. They were not given transportation to get to their home villages. Many of them were walking many miles close together. And so they became a source of a super spreader event, so to speak. All of these people walking long ways closely packed together. So I think that the hope is that the government will be more present. And certainly I'm talking about state governments, about city officials, but also about the central government on the whole. Ideally, these individuals, especially since vaccine campaigns have been rolled out, these individuals will be targeted by authorities to ensure that they get, first of all, the medical care that they need and deserve, but that's difficult with the health infrastructure overwhelmed right now in India, but also to ensure that they get vaccines. I think that, vaccine distribution has really amplified inequalities in India, not just in India, but in many parts of the developing world, just because it's so much easier for those in urban spaces or those that have resources, have connections. It's easier for them to get vaccines quickly. Whereas those that arguably need them the most, particularly those that are elderly and poor, it's harder for them to get them. That is why there needs to be more of a targeting campaign to ensure that equal attention is paid to get the vaccines to those on the margins of society, and really those that just don't have the resources to be well connected and to access these vaccinations, particularly those on the private market, which are just very difficult to access. So I think it's important for the government to acknowledge these very real inequalities and to try to do whatever is possible to make this a truly mass vaccination campaign so that everyone that needs a vaccine can get one.
Exactly. Well, it seems that this is going to justify the situation. And this is bringing me to my next question. So, sir, India and Pakistan have always been seen as arch rivals. Although there have been talks between both the countries to improve bilateral ties, terrorism is a major barrier which isn't allowing these countries to develop friendly relations. How can the authorities of both the countries deal with this common problem of terrorism?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if there was ever a moment when it would be nice if the two countries could get along better, it would be now, just because of the fact that both countries are experiencing very dangerous and deadly surges of the pandemic. It would be ideal if they could figure out ways to pool resources and share know-how and medical tools and medical assistance. That may be in the cards, but not yet. So to your question, indeed, I think there's been a fair amount of optimism about the potential for progress in making the relationship work better ever since you had this border ceasefire that was signed several months ago. And I think that is a confidence building measure that can enable the two countries to work together in other areas, such as raising the possibility of opening up limited trade. I think there could be possibilities to have dialogues on river, transboundary river issues, and potentially on public health issues like the pandemic. But I think that the core issue, so to speak, which for Pakistan is the Kashmir issue and which for India is the terrorism issue, I just don't see there being any progress on that. When it comes to terrorism, I think that Pakistan would say that it has taken a number of steps to show that it's serious about cracking down on terrorism. It points to the arrests and convictions of terrorist leaders. It talks about shutting down the operations of terrorist groups. But these are things we've seen before, and these latest steps, I think, are meant to be in response to pressure from the Financial Action Task Force, a global terrorist financing body that has threatened to sanction Pakistan if it doesn't do more about terrorist financing. But the problem is that Pakistan has not taken the steps that India would want to see, and which much of the world would want to see, such as completely shutting down these terrorist groups and their financing and their networks, their training centers, their educational facilities, everything. That hasn't happened yet. I don't see it happening. And the same goes for complete justice when it comes to convicting those responsible for the Mumbai terrorist attacks. I know that's something that India really wants to see more progress on. But Pakistan, for its own reasons, I think is not willing to go that far. And that's unfortunate. And certainly that will prevent this relationship from making the types of progress that so many of us want to see it making.
Exactly. Also, sir, I believe that no country can alone tackle this issue of terrorism. For tackling this terrorism thing, the whole world needs to come together, because terrorism is a widespread problem, not just amongst India and Pakistan, but also in the entire world. Terrorism is spread worldwide. So as of now, there must be some policies framed by the United Nations, which I believe that must exist, related to terrorism. What's your viewpoint on that? Are these policies actually being followed to combat terrorism?
Well, unfortunately, one of the challenges about international law and the world order is that you don't have any legal mechanisms with enforcement capacities. So, you have the UN, which can issue resolutions and statements, which it does, but it can't enforce those. It could try to come out with them and hope that for normative reasons, that people just, because they feel it's the right thing to do, that governments will heed them and do whatever is necessary to crack down on terrorism and the extremist ideologies that drive terrorism. But at the end of the day, it comes down to national governments themselves. But this is a huge global problem. And I think it's important that looking at the definition of terrorism itself, I think that, certainly in India and Pakistan for that matter, that when you think about terrorism, you think of Islamist terrorism. But, I would argue that here in the United States, you have these far-right racists that staged attacks. I consider that terrorism. Those that go into schools and hospitals in the United States and with their guns and start killing people, that's terrorism. So anything that instills terror in a population is terrorism. It's all bad. But unfortunately, it's difficult to muster some type of global consensus to deal with the problem on a global level, just because you don't have those strong legal enforcement mechanisms with teeth, so to speak. Now, of course, there are times when you have a particularly major terrorist attack, like the 9/11 attacks here in the U.S. almost 20 years ago. That was a time where the world did come together to condemn terrorism. And then, of course, the U.S. Launched its intervention in Afghanistan, which was a mission to eliminate terrorists. And it got a lot of support from other countries. It became a NATO mission. But sort of broadly speaking, that's just one example. And I think that there's so many other cases where it's difficult to assume that there could be a broader global effort to bring the world together. And especially at a time like now, where there's not much cooperation in the world on the whole, and multilateralism is really, I would argue, on the defensive.
First of all, my heart goes out to the families who recently lost their lives in the in those gun attacks that took place in a departmental store in the United States. And I hope there's a global movement soon to combat this global problem of terrorism. With this, moving on to the next question, sir. So the Indian government introduced new farm laws back in 2020, and since then, we have seen a massive protest on the borders of national capital and in various parts of our country. How can the government amend these new laws in order to increase the agreeableness of the farmers and benefit both the parties?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that these new farm laws and the protests that came after them really represents what I would describe as a very important flashpoint in India. And I don't mean that in a security context. I mean it in an economic context. Essentially, I think we can all agree that India's agricultural sector needs reforms. It has really been struggling. It's inefficient. It's further weakened by water shortages and climate change impacts. So there needs to be reform. But I think that for many of these farmers that are unhappy with these laws as they appear now, I think that they are very concerned about anything that could change their current state of affairs, because they believe that the price guarantees that they would get from government markets would be jeopardized because of the fear that the private sector could come in and change all of that. So I think that clearly there needs to be a middle ground. There needs to be acknowledgments from the Indian government that these farmers are in many cases vulnerable and really would worry for their livelihoods that any type of changes are made that could make them think that they could not depend on those government markets and government guaranteed prices. But things need to change for sure, because the agricultural sector needs to strengthen. But the problem is that there's been a lot of intransigence, including among the farmers and the protesters, who even when told that by the government that these new laws could be delayed for more than a year, they still haven't been willing to accept that. So I think that you really need to find some type of middle ground, which will be difficult. But honestly, looking at this beyond the immediate term, I think here this is a reminder of the need to strengthen key economic sectors away from agriculture, particularly in cities. India is urbanizing at a very rapid rate. There's a lot of economic opportunities in cities. And I think that if you could create more opportunities, especially for young people outside of agriculture, then you would eventually slowly be able to ease the country away from such heavy dependence on agriculture and more focus on high growth sectors and urban spaces, whether you're talking about IT or tech stuff or that type of thing. And that would be good for the Indian economy. It would also mitigate climate change threats, just because agriculture is so susceptible to climate change. And ultimately, it would be a good thing for prosperity and stability in India. But of course, this is not something that can be done overnight.
Well, that's an impressive statement. And I guess amending these laws and bringing them to a conclusion may bring agreeableness amongst the farmers, and this would justify this would provide justice to farmers as well as the laws framed by the government. Moving on to the next question, sir. So this particular question is something that I really wanted to ask you. The United States of America shared sweet relations with India during Trump's administration. Now that we have Biden-Harris government, what kind of relationships are expected in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the relationship will continue to be very strong and warm, and that would have been the case whether Trump was reelected or not. And that's because there is bipartisan support in the U.S. for a strong, particularly a strong U.S.-India security relationship, but for a strong relationship on the whole. And there's been a pattern that has developed since the early 1990s. Once India passed initial liberalization reforms in the early 90s and opened itself up to the world, that created opportunities for cooperation between two countries, the U.S. and India, that had really not gotten along very well at all during the Cold War period. So relations started to grow then, and then over the next decade, they started to grow more because each country recognized the shared threat of Islamist terrorism. But then more recently, over the last few years, what's really brought the country together is the shared interest about concern over China's rise. And this is really the reason today why there's so much support in Washington across political boundaries for a strong U.S.-India relationship, because of a recognition that India is essentially Washington's best strategic bet in South Asia in terms of a country that can work with the United States to push back against China's rise and its increasingly muscular and aggressive and provocative actions in the broader Asia region. So I think the relationship will be okay. Now, some have been concerned that the Biden administration, with its focus on democracy promotion and human rights, will be more willing to be critical of India for its human rights issues, particularly in Kashmir, and that could have an impact on the relationship. I don't think we should overstate that possibility. Certainly, this is an administration that will talk about human rights issues. But I think that when it comes to its relationship with key partners, strategic partners like India, I think that any criticism like that would be reserved for being shared privately behind closed doors, where it wouldn't be embarrassing or harmful for the relationship. Now, there are some concerns in the relationship. The trade tensions that came out during the Trump administration have not yet been resolved. And, there are other geopolitical issues, like the fact that the U.S. continues on insisting on having a workable relationship with Pakistan. That's problematic for the relationship. India's continued relationship with Russia is a concern for the U.S.-India relationship. India's desire for good relations with Iran, that's a problem. But these are things that could be managed. And I think that at the end of the day, this is a relationship that we can safely predict will be fine and will ride out any storms that it experiences. And if there are any storms, they won't be violent storms. They'll just be minor. They'll just be some minor downpours that each side will be able to easily weather.
That's great. Now, I have been following Madam Vice President on Instagram, and I saw a lot of decisions being taken by the current administration regarding the issue of climate change. Given that the USA is a global power, how do you think decisions being taken in your country are going to impact South Asian countries or the rest of the world? I'm asking in concern of climate. Related decisions being taken.
Yeah, well, this is not just talk. I mean, this is something that's really important to the Biden administration. And the fact that one of the first appointments that President Biden made was to create a new position of a special envoy for climate change to be posted in the National Security Council, and to give that job to John Kerry, who's one of the most distinguished U.S. statesmen, diplomats, politicians of his time. That, I think, highlights just how much of a premium importance this administration places on climate change. It's hosting a global summit involving about 40 world leaders to discuss climate challenges. India, of course, is a part of that summit. And I think that the idea there is to try to start developing some type of global consensus on the ways forward for how you could muster some level of cooperation to combat what is arguably the most dangerous long-term global threat, climate change. I think it is also important that the administration has signaled its willingness to set aside its rivalry with China to try to work with Beijing, which is one of the top carbon emitters in the world, to figure out ways to partner together to reduce those carbon emissions and to ensure that China does a better job of mitigating its climate unfriendly policies. But indeed, what the U.S. decides to do about climate change will clearly have impacts on the world. For one thing, the U.S. is the world's, at least for now, the world's only superpower, though China is getting close. And I think there's also a strong desire on the part of the Biden administration to restore its alliances and to restore multilateralism, restore the U.S. Status as a global international diplomatic leader. And one of the major priority areas in that context will be climate change. So you will see from the Biden administration efforts to lead and set up a number of global conferences, not just the one happening, or the virtual one happening with the White House, a number of virtual conferences, a number of negotiations with as many players as possible, including U.S. rivals, which I think is important.
Okay, that's great, sir. And so this brings me to the Uniline Power question of the week, which is asked by Tanya Srivastav. Would Kamala Harris' Indian ancestry have any significant impact on United States and India relations? What do you believe, sir?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first answer to that question is that Kamala Harris herself, setting aside her Indian ancestry, she, I think, has the ability to have a significant impact on U.S.-India relations just because she is going to be an unusually active vice president in major policy considerations. I mean, typically U.S. vice presidents are there, but they don't really have as strong of a role in making decisions on policy, certainly as the president. But I think that President Biden really wants his vice president to have a very active role. One reason for that could be that Biden may envision himself as a one-term president. He's not young, and he may envision only being there for one term and wants to start grooming Vice President Harris to ensure that she's ready to replace him if he doesn't run and she runs instead of him and wins the 2024 election. So that's one thing. So that means that she could have a pretty significant role in shaping policy toward India. In terms of her Indian ancestry, I wouldn't overstate that the impact of that. My sense with Kamala Harris is that she has never worn her Indian ancestry on her sleeve. I mean, she's obviously somewhat of mixed ancestry, and I think that she tends to promote her other ancestry more so than her Indian ancestry. She does talk about her family relations to India and her mother and that type of thing, but she doesn't really wear that on her sleeve. And I think that one thing that Biden wanted to do with his administration was to have as many people of color in his administration as possible. Really, and that's why there's a large number of Indian Americans in the administration, I think more than in any other U.S. administration. But that's not just because of a desire to try to send a message to India that, we have a lot of Indian Americans, we want that to help strengthen our relationship with India. I think that Biden wanted to have an administration that reflects what America really looks like, which is a diverse country that includes a very large Indian diaspora. So I think that Harris will help promote U.S.-India relations, but not because of her Indian ancestry, but because she, like everyone else in the administration, including Biden, is interested in strengthening the U.S.-India relationship. One final note on this, some have pointed out that Harris has actually been very critical at times of India's policy in Kashmir, suggesting that she could actually be problematic for U.S.-India relations. But I wouldn't overstate that. She made those comments before she became a vice president on the campaign trail. And I think that given the importance that U.S. officials view the relationship with India with, they're going to be very cautious about how their messaging, their public messaging toward India, including the human rights issues in Kashmir that I mentioned earlier. So I think bottom line is she'll be good for U.S.-India relations, but not because of her Indian ancestry per se, but because of her broader desire, along with that of the rest of the administration, to have a good relationship with India.
So indeed a very justified answer. And even I have seen that Kamala Harris is actually not wearing her Indian ancestry on her sleeve. She has some associations with Indians, and of course, one has some love for their ancestry. But she's not completely wearing it on her sleeve and promoting it. Exactly, yeah. So now we move on to the second round of the interview, that is the rapid fire round. The instructions are simple. You will be asked 10 questions randomly, and you have 5 seconds to answer those. So the first thing that strikes your mind is going to be the answer. So are you ready?
Yeah, sounds like fun. Let's do it.
Okay, so the first one is one word for Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Misleading.
Misleading. Okay, that's...
Yeah, I'm happy to clarify. Well, I think self-reliance, it's self-reliance, right? Yeah. I really feel that the self-reliance policy is about more than that. It's about global cooperation, trying to get other countries to work with India to make itself more self-reliance. So that's why I said misleading. I don't know if the term does justice to what it actually entails.
Okay. One word for Chinese economy.
Resilience.
One word for Southeast Asia.
Supply chains. That's a compound word, but...
Yeah. One word for coronavirus.
Catastrophic.
You have to rate now. Scale 1 to 10, India's GDP growth rate.
6.
Scale 1 to 10, Donald Trump's administration.
2.
That's controversial. Now, scale 1 to 10, Kamala Harris and Biden's administration, as far as we have seen it right now.
Yeah, it's a bit early days, so it's hard to give a ranking here. But I would say at this point, 6.
Okay. What are the most reliable sources you refer to while writing articles? The most reliable sources for you?
Trusted contacts. Oh, sorry, that's 2 words. Network.
Network, that's great. Was there a subject you struggled with at school?
Biology. It was a disaster.
Okay. Which is the most used app on your phone?
Twitter. It's an addiction.
Twitter. Okay. So that explains your massive fan following on Twitter.
Maybe. There could be other possibilities too.
What's that one thing people assume about you and is false?
Journalist. Many think I'm a journalist. I'm not.
Okay. One myth that you believed as a child.
life on other planets.
Life on other planets.
These life on other planets, yeah.
Okay, so what are your current views about this? Life on other planets?
Well, that's a very philosophical question there. Yeah, my views have evolved, but I haven't studied that type of thing to have enough of a sense. But I think that it certainly could be a possibility, and we just have not sort of ventured far enough to discover what might lie may lie beyond us.
Okay, so do we have Sir's photograph that we found on Twitter? And if anyone is presenting it? Okay, so this question is to... Yeah, sir, so we have one of your photographs we found on Twitter. Would you like to tell something about this photograph?
Oh dear. I'm not sure why I posted this. Let's see. Yeah, so a photograph with two pictures of me, right? Is that what you're referring to? Yeah. So there had been a time when it was popular to post pictures of ourselves when we were 20 years old. And I'm very old, so I haven't been 20 for many, many decades. And the picture on the left is a casual shot taken by some type of context I don't quite remember. And then the other one, I believe, was my first day of work after graduating from college. And someone took a picture of me. And looking at this picture now, it makes me feel about as old as someone could possibly feel, because it's hard to believe I was that young at one point. But I was. We all grow up fast. We all know that, but that's important to emphasize.
So one advice you would give to your younger self, because we all are in the same phase of lives as depicted in this photograph. So that advice is going to be very fruitful for us. One advice you will give to your younger self.
Well, I think honestly you should try to do everything you can to go outside of your comfort level when you're young. I tried to do that to the extent that you can. Try to travel. Well, not now. When things are normal, try to travel to a place that you wouldn't ordinarily want to visit. And it doesn't have to be abroad. It could be somewhere in India. Try to interact with people that have views that you disagree with. Interrogate your own preconceived notions and biases. Try to expose yourself to as many different things that you can, different views you don't agree with. Take a class that you don't think would interest you. That type of thing. So try to broaden your boundaries as much as you can. Be willing to go out of your comfort level, because when you're younger, it's okay to take that risk. Whereas when you get a bit older like me, you have to be a bit more conservative about these things.
Okay. So with this we come... So with this we come to end to rapid fire round by DSC, and along with this we come to the end of the interview session as well. Honestly, this was a very enjoyable interview for me, especially because I, like you said, go out of your comfort zone and do things. And so this was something out of my comfort zone. I'm camera shy. I'm really camera shy, and I guess my friends know that. So
you did very well. You come across as a natural and a professional at this. Maybe you should have a career in journalism.
That's okay. Well, that's great advice. I always look out to. I wish that I can have a career in journalism in future. So thank you so much for this interview, sir.
I hope you have enjoyed this episode of FIC Charcha with Mr. Michael Kugelman. We will be serving you with more such entertaining content in coming weeks. So stay tuned. Now it's the time for the thing you all have been waiting for, and that is the giveaway. In order to win this giveaway, you need to comment down your views regarding this episode, and don't forget to tag your 5 special friends. We will randomly pick the winner. 3 lucky winners who will win an Amazon voucher worth ₹200. So don't let this golden opportunity go to waste. For more updates, follow our Instagram page, that is FICRL. But before we end, let me give you a quick sneak peek into our next guest. Despite being a school dropout at the age of 14, he has successfully managed to become India's youngest billionaire. He started his fintech company in the year 2010 with his elder brother and witnessed the highest market share in the field. Yes, you guessed him right. He's none other than Mr. Nikhil Kamath, So stay tuned with us for the next episode of FIC Charcha coming next Saturday. Till then, stay healthy and stay safe. This is Sufia Salim signing off. Thank you.
So do you have a morning go-to drink? Like, how do you start your morning?
I'm not an alcoholic, Simran. I start in the morning.
No, I meant like a cup of coffee or green tea probably.
Well, I think I have green tea in the morning, yeah.
Green tea. That's a healthier choice. We have the co-founder of Zerodha in-house. Do you also see Zerodha possibly going public anytime in the future?
I don't think so. As a company, we've never done any marketing. We've never put out a single ad, be it digitally or physically or in a newspaper or on TV for that matter. So since we have no cost of acquisition, our clients come through word of mouth primarily.